Good evening. I'm Amy Sangiolo, Vice Chair of the Newton Democratic City Committee and Chair of the new Climate Crisis Subcommittee. I'd like to welcome everyone to another of our panels about the climate crisis. Whether because of the increased incidence of extreme weather, rising or warming seas, the energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or any of 1,000 other reasons, people everywhere are recognizing that society has to change its relationship to fossil fuels. But what are the best ways of doing this? And what is already being done? These are the issues we will try to address in our panels and hopefully provide you with the information you need to understand solutions being considered or implemented so that you can choose to get involved as a voter, as an activist, or as a consumer. Tonight, we're focusing on nuclear energy. Radioactive pollution, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima have tarnished the reputation of the nuclear industry. But with over 400 operational reactors in the world, 92 of which generate 50% of U.S. domestic carbon-free electricity, and 53 more reactors under construction worldwide, nuclear will be with us for a while. The 2022 Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act all provided new funding, tax credits, or both to promote nuclear energy to help fight the threat of climate change. Do these investments represent the beginning of a nuclear renaissance or life support for an industry soon to be replaced by wind and solar? Tonight, we have an impressive panel of experts to discuss the current status and future of nuclear energy in the U.S. Bob Kalantari, CEO of Engineering Planning and Management, will be our moderator this evening. Bob, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Amy. Thank you for a great introduction. We are pleased to have this panel to share our views about the role that nuclear energy can play in, decarbonization. But before I start that, what I would like also to share is emphasize is what you mentioned, which is bipartisan support, and especially in recognition of the Black History Month. I would like to mention 4 important people that played a very crucial role in our nuclear legislation, and I'm going to just list them. Representative James Claiborne from South Carolina, advocate for clean energy. He played a crucial role in establishing a production tax credit for existing and new plants. Second one is Representative Byron Donald, Republican from Florida, a vocal nuclear energy advocate, introduced pro-nuclear legislation and is committed to energy innovation, clean energy jobs, and establishing American competitiveness. Then it's Representative Terry Sewell, Democrat from Alabama. She serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, and like Representative Claiborne, she was instrumental in creating tax credits for new and existing nuclear plants. Also, Senator Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina, he supports nuclear as a reliable, clean energy and as an effective tool to reducing energy prices for consumers. So we all most likely know all these 4 lawmakers, I should say. They may have very different views when it comes to many issues, but on this issue, they are all on the same page. So that's important to note that. So with that, I'm going to start the meeting, and I'm going to introduce myself, a little bit about me, and also the 3 people we have on panel to say a few words about themselves. Then we're going to go through a structured process of asking a set of questions from our panelists to share their views about the different issues. But we would like to leave plenty of time for Q&A and hopefully at least 20, 25 minutes at the end. So this is where we are. So with that, again, I'm Robert Kalantari. I'm been involved with the industry since late 90s when I was a co-op student working at Boston Edison. In 1979, they put me in nuclear engineering department. If you don't know, they used to own Pilgrim Nuclear Station. As an electrical engineer, I fell in love with the technology. I was with them when TMI accident happened, March 28th of 1979. That did not change my mind. When I finished college in 1982, I chose a nuclear career. All my career has been in nuclear construction, engineering, design, and addressing safety issues. I have assisted many utilities in the US and overseas, including Japan, including Russia, Ukraine, Armenia, Japan, to name few, and also north of the border, Canada. So I think the technology is matured and it should be part of our solution. So hopefully this discussion would give our audience a clear understanding of where we are, where we need to go, and how we're going to get there. So with that, I'm going to introduce our three individuals we have on the panel in no specific order. I have Sukesh Agara. Sukesh, if you can say a few words about you, and thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for sharing your evening with us. I'm Sukesh Agara. I'm the professor of nuclear engineering and the director of nuclear engineering program at UMass Lowell. And I'm also the associate dean for graduate studies and research for the College of Engineering. I actually moved to New England about 11 years ago from an energy state of Texas, where we like everything, to an education capital of United States and the world, because I really see the passion of workforce development, how important it is not only to the nuclear, but everything that we do in the world of innovation. I graduated with my PhD in nuclear engineering when we were graduating under 50 students with PhD in nuclear engineering sciences back in the early 2000s. So I drank the Kool-Aid of Renaissance, and I truly believe that we are there now, and we always have been. For 60 years, we've been operating nuclear power plants safely and reliably, providing a substantial amount of energy to United States, and it's being considered globally in developing and developed countries. So I won't talk a lot about my research, but one of the things that I've really been involved with is through the Peaceful Use Initiative. I am involved for the last 10 years in developing training programs and utilizing the U.S. superiority in educational and training for nuclear science and engineering, and sharing that peaceful use of nuclear energy globally. And so I lead that program of the Intercontinental Nuclear Institute that I think is of relevance to our conversation. But with that, Bob, back to you.
Thank you, Sukesh. Next is Jacopo Buongiorno.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. I'm Jacopo Buongiorno. I'm a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT. I also direct the Center for Advanced Nuclear Energy Systems at the Institute. I was born and grew up in Italy, came to the US in the late 90s for graduate school, never left. Best decision of my life, frankly. I work at the Idaho National Lab in the early stages of my career, and then I received the proverbial offer that I could not refuse from MIT to become a member of the faculty. So I joined in 2004 and have been at MIT since then. Relevant to this conversation, I led a study, an interdisciplinary study between 2016 and 2018 on the future of nuclear energy in a carbon-constrained world. So what the prospects of nuclear technology are, specifically as it relates to the desire to decarbonize the energy sector. And so some of the remarks I'll make in answer to the questions today are drawn really from the primary research that we conducted at MIT in previous years. So I'm glad to be here, and Bob, back to you.
Thank you, Jacopo. Thank you, and then we have John Kotek. John, please.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Hi, everyone. John Kotek. I'm Senior Vice President for Policy and Public Affairs at a group called the Nuclear Energy Institute, or a trade association. Coming to you from just outside of Washington, D.C., although I will claim some Massachusetts credit. I'm a product of Wayland High School. So good to be back with some of my former neighbors. Before joining NEI, I ran the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Nuclear Energy the last 2 years of the Obama administration. been in nuclear most of my career. In fact, Jacopo and I crossed paths out in Idaho about 20 years ago when I was working at what was then Argonne National Laboratory West in southeastern Idaho. So have been working spent most of my career in the DOE and national lab side of things on research and development programs and on the nuclear waste issue, and really look forward to the conversation tonight. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, John. Thank you. So great. So with that, we're going to get into, as I said, a set of questions we put together. And the first question, I just want to make sure our audience understands when we say nuclear power, what does it mean, just in layman terms, so the audience would have an appreciation of what's the difference between a nuclear power plant and a gas-fired or oil-fired. We don't have too many of those, thankfully. And what are those? So basically the question is, and this goes to Dr. Sukesh Agra, I call it demystifying electrical power generation using nuclear power. How do we generate electricity using steam from fossil fuel versus nuclear fuel? So this is something that I think, would help the audience understand, what is the process. We are not going to get too much into reactor physics, but very high level. Go ahead, Sukesh, please.
Thanks, Bob. I think the audience in Massachusetts is very educated and informed, so I'll keep this very simple. Essentially, nuclear and how does that compare to fossil fuel? Both of them traditionally are what we call they utilize the thermal cycle. So essentially, you need some kind of an energetic fluid, mostly steam, that we would use to basically turn the turbines, and then that would then be coupled to a generator to produce electricity. So in order to produce that steam, you use some form of an energy source, typically fossil fuel. We used to use coal, wood, then to natural gas, which is a big percentage of electricity that we use today in the New England region. And then nuclear. So nuclear essentially produces it's a very high energy density source, produces a factor of a million more in terms of energy that we can extract from those nuclear processes. And in doing so, it does not produce any carbon dioxide, which is why we like it. And it just translates that into steam, and then steam into electricity. How's that?
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's it. So basically, we have to turn something, and the power to turn that machine is steam, and we can make steam by, as Sukesh said, with fossil fuel or burning wood or trash or, hydro plants. We use water to turn a turbine. But in this case, we are splitting atoms to generate heat. And basically, at the end of the day, we are boiling water to turn into steam. So that's after that, everything else is the same for a nuclear power plant versus a gas-fired plant, the turbine cycle and all that. So that's, again, I want at high level everybody have a good understanding. The second question, this one goes to Jacopo, and that's why electricity generation using nuclear power is resurging in the US and many other countries.
Yeah, so I've been in this business for a little bit over 25 years, and I have to tell you that the support that we're seeing for nuclear at the moment is the best I've seen it in my career. The past couple of years, 2021, 2022, have been a bit of an inflection point. Let me quickly walk you through a few factors that lead me to this conclusion. First and foremost, I think Amy already mentioned it in her introduction. The invasion of Ukraine has certainly highlighted the importance of energy security. I call it an energy security epiphany. This is particularly true for Europe, which is fairly poor in natural resources. We're very lucky in the US to be at this point almost self-sufficient energy-wise, but Europe, the situation is very different. They were dependent very heavily on Russian natural gas, and the invasion of Ukraine has clearly changed the situation quite dramatically. So that has automatically shifted the emphasis towards energy sources that are more domestically controlled, so to speak. Also, climate change has played a big role. Sukesh already mentioned it. The one of the features, one of the desirable features of nuclear energy is that it does not emit CO2, so it can be used as a clean energy source for climate change adaptation and mitigation. And this is starting to be recognized. A couple of things that I like to highlight: the big international gatherings that take place every year, COP26, which was in Glasgow, COP27, which was in Egypt, for the first time really allowed nuclear a place at the table for nuclear. So there are now some climate policies that are being developed again in Europe, most prominently also here in the United States and elsewhere in the world. I'm thinking about the so-called EU taxonomy that finally are starting to create a level playing for all clean energy technologies, nuclear included, solar, wind, hydro, and all the others. We have seen an announcement a couple of years ago by China, an announcement and a commitment to greatly expand their already considerable capacity of nuclear generation. Just to get quantitative, 150 gigawatts in 15 years, which, if they can pull it off, and I think they have the capabilities, the supply chain, and the discipline to pull it off, it will be the largest expansion of nuclear capacity in history, bigger than the very famous program in France back in the 70s and the 80s, as well as bigger than the fleet that we currently operate in the United States. There were very consequential political elections in both Sweden and South Korea. These are two countries that, following the Fukushima accident, had announced a nuclear phase out. The very recent elections have actually brought in new governments which have canceled those nuclear phase outs and in fact have recommitted the countries to building new nuclear power plants. Even Japan, which has suffered greatly from the Fukushima accident back in 2011, the current government has announced that they want to restart the idle nuclear power plants to meet their energy security and climate change mitigation goals. There is a whole suite of countries in Europe, France, Finland, Sweden, Netherlands, UK, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, which have recommitted and announced the build of new nuclear power plants. It has already been mentioned that the US government has put a lot of money on the table in support of all clean energy technologies, including nuclear, particularly through the Inflation Reduction Act and then the infrastructure bill, which was approved in the past year plus. We finally have some projects that have been launched for construction of new nuclear plants. Maybe we'll get to this in later questions and answers about what those technologies are. These tend to be a little bit smaller. We call them small modular reactors or dense modular reactors. But now we have some real projects here ongoing in the US as well. Just today, there was a major announcement by Dow Chemical. This is not a nuclear company that has formed, however, a partnership with X-Energy, which is a nuclear technology development company. And they are planning to deploy several of X-Energy nuclear reactors at a chemical plant in, I think, Louisiana or Texas, for the purpose of decarbonizing the process that produces those chemicals. So we're starting to see nuclear also being used beyond the traditional application, which is grid-connected electricity generation, now being used also for heat markets. And then maybe the last one I'm going to mention, probably my favorite because I had a minor role in it. You might have heard that the California's remaining nuclear power plant, which is Diablo Canyon on the central coast, was slated to shut down in 2024, 2025. And so last year, through a pretty complex and involved process and debate, etc., the legislature on September 1st of 2022 overwhelmingly voted to allow PG&E, which is the company that owns and operates that plant, to apply for a license extension of Diablo Canyon. So even California, which for many years was sort of leading the charge against nuclear energy, now is reevaluating, reconsidering. So I offer this as just evidence that indeed the situation, the boundary conditions, the context for nuclear is very, very positive. Having said this, and I will get to it, and I think in one of the next questions, the industry's got to deliver, and that's where the big uncertainties are. So now the ball is back into the industry court. So Bob, back to you.
Well, thank you, Jacobo. Thank you. And it's important what Jacobo mentioned about California. For those of you may not know, we have two huge nuclear power plants in California. really big ones, and they are in good running condition. They are not that old, and they were going to pull the plug on that, and they were getting ready to decommission those plants. And finally, after many efforts, those plants are safe, at least for the next 10 years. But I also heard recently that California is actually thinking about adding, as Jacobo said, these small modular reactors, actually build new ones, which is as I said, from a year ago, that's a big change. So climate is changing or for nuclear. So the third question goes to John, and this is the question is, why electricity generation using nuclear power must be part of renewable and carbon-free mix of options? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And I think it's important to recognize just how far we have to go in decarbonizing our electric grid and what a transition that's going to represent. So, as you may know, currently we get a little more than 60% of our electricity from fossil fuels here in the U.S. Most of that's natural gas, but if you look at the 2021 data, something on the order of 22% of the electricity in the U.S. is still coming from coal. We clearly need to move away from those carbon-intensive energy resources. The challenge is that, like nuclear, you can run a coal plant, you can run a gas plant in what folks used to call baseload mode, or it's firm or dispatchable power, meaning you can turn it on and off when you need it. As we add more and more wind and solar on the grid, those technologies, of course, while they're very affordable and carbon-free, they don't offer that ability to run in a dispatchable mode. Now you can add battery storage, but that gets very expensive. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so as we see the amount of dispatchable generation from fossil fuels decrease on the grid, we're going to need something that can run in that firm clean mode to make up for it. And so while there's a lot of room to grow wind and solar in the US, and again, as you may know, the latest 2021 data, wind represented a little north of 9% of generation in the US, solar was a little less than 3%. You could see where wind and solar combined could easily get to be over half of the generation in the US, but you're going to need something that's firm to complement that. I'll drop in the chat a link to a very influential paper that came out of MIT, I guess no surprise, about 5 years ago, that highlighted the important role of firm clean generation in getting to an affordable, reliable, low carbon grid. But the key is that by having that dispatchable generation that's carbon free from nuclear, you avoid having to overbuild wind, solar, long distance transmission, and long duration storage that would otherwise just be relied on for a few hours a year to meet our electric demands, and therefore would cause the cost of the overall system to go way up. And that's the key point I'd like to leave you with. New nuclear is going to be more expensive than a new solar farm in Arizona. It just is. Okay, but the value it delivers by virtue of being both firm and clean actually leads to a result where, when you look at the overall system, having new nuclear on the system gets you to a more affordable, reliable grid. And at the end of the day, what people have to pay for their power, how reliable that power is what really matters. And that really is the place where nuclear shines. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you. The fourth question goes back to Sukesh, and the question is, why is it important to have a good mix of electrical power generation capacity for energy security, climate, grid stability, resilience, jobs, etc.? Go ahead, Sukesh.
Well, thanks, Bob. So I guess I'll pick up where John just mentioned, reliable energy source. And for somebody who grew up in India back in the 80s, it was known that we would not have electricity at all 2 days a week. And there was a 1 day a week where basically, and I'm not talking small village. I lived in a highly populated, one of the largest cities in India, very industrialized. But the industries on every alternate Saturdays would have to shut down because there was no electricity available. And this is on the days when I grew up, nobody had air conditioning, so our utilization of electricity was very minimal. So when you start thinking about adding electrification of how we utilize electricity, and if the electrification of transportation sector, it becomes critically important that we have a reliable baseload power supply that complements renewable. And then you have to put that in context. If you're just looking at domestically in the United States, just right now, if you pull up California ISO, you're looking at about 42% of its total energy consumption, which is about 23,000 megawatts, is coming from renewable. Fantastic. 44% of that is solar. Great. But if you contrast that to the New England ISO, only 5% is renewable, of which wind and solar is under 3%. So we are a very small percent of a small percent. And that regional context has to be put in perspective. So for United States, we're lucky. We are very resource intensive. So unlike in Central Europe, where French don't necessarily have any seaboards, they have to really rely on energy coming in. I think my fellow panelists mentioned about how Germany basically decided to not shut down their nuclear power plants because of the ongoing, national security and the war in Ukraine issues. So I think it is very important as the transportation sector electrifies, as we start to reduce our reliance on fossil energy sources for industrial use, and potentially even start to look at hydrogen as in the future years, that we keep nuclear as part of that mix in addition to renewable and continue to reduce our reliance on fossil fuel-based sources. And that not only gives us the resiliency, the robustness of a workforce that can actually be utilized nationally and also globally. So I think I would leave you with the idea that we do have a grid in spite of all of the growth in renewable, which we need to have. In fact, I am waiting for my solar panels to show up on my house. I love the fact that I can charge my Tesla off of it, but at the end of the day, I can still remember very distinctly growing up in India, where I knew that I was not going to have any electricity on Wednesdays and Saturdays. And I certainly moved, like my fellow panelists, to United States and decided to make United States my home because electricity is taken for granted and we rely on it to be available at all times. And I think that having a diversified grid is going to be very important for consumer and security perspective. Back to you, John.
Thank you. And this is important. This is a good segue for our next question. Basically, you can put solar panels and maybe have enough power to light your house and maybe run certain electrical devices depending on the size or whatnot. I can go bigger and go to a smaller country, and we have countries of 300,000 people, Greenland or Iceland. These are small countries, small economy, not much industry there. So the power need is different, and they may be able to get away with 80% all wind and solar because of their needs. But when you talk about an economy like US, the equation changes drastically. And this is the question that I have for John. What would it take to decarbonize the grid in a larger economy?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And that really is the crucial challenge that we're facing now. Interestingly, the paper I drop a link to in the chat, which I encourage you to check out if you're interested in understanding more about the role of firm and clean generation. One of the authors of that paper graduated MIT and then became a professor at Princeton, a guy by the name of Jesse Jenkins, who was involved in the next report I want to recommend to you all. It's called From Ambition to Reality. And Jenkins and his colleagues at Princeton worked with a prominent engineering firm to try to visualize just what it's going to take to decarbonize, to get us off of that 60+% of our grid that is currently powered by fossil fuels while still maintaining affordability and reliability. And what they did was they looked at two almost diametrically opposed scenarios. One where we try to do the whole job with 100% renewables, including battery storage. And then one where we've got technologies like nuclear and also natural gas with carbon capture. And I encourage you to check it out. I'll drop a link in to this as well. What they found was that in any event, it's going to take trillions of dollars worth of investment. Right? There's no two ways about it. In particular, if we're talking about electrifying more and more things like transportation, building, heating, and other applications that are just going to further drive up demand on the grid. You know, we might have to produce twice as much electricity in 2050 as we do today, and getting there is going to require a massive build out of new technologies. If you have things like nuclear and gas with carbon capture available, you wind up having to build a lot less long distance transmission. You wind up having to use a lot less land to host solar and wind. You wind up using a lot less of the minerals required to build the and operate the long duration battery storage that you would otherwise need. So what I'd encourage you to do is take a look at this report. In particular, if you're interested in getting a good visual, I commend to you page 13 of this report, which shows under those two scenarios how much of different types of things would you have to build. So, for example, under their constrained renewables pathway, we would need to install about 20,000 megawatts of solar power each year. That equates to, if you look at the largest solar project in the US right now, we'd have to build 35 of them per year, each and every year out through 2050. That's under the constrained renewables case, all right? Under the unconstrained case, you wind up building about 4 times that much. It just gives you a sense of the scale of the investment that's going to be required to get there in any case, but I think it will also give you an appreciation for why my fellow panelists and I think that by including nuclear energy as part of that system, we can get there in a way that's relatively more achievable while also keeping costs down and while maintaining system reliability. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you, John. Thank you. So we are almost halfway through, and now we get into some of the technical stuff, which is our 6th question, and this one goes to Jacobo. And the question is the state of new technology development. So what are the new technologies? Nuclear technology has been around since late 50s, I would say. So what are the new technologies? And Jacobo, if you can give us a high level.
Yeah, great question. So let me start by quickly summarizing what the old technologies look like. So 99% of the nuclear reactors that are used for commercial power generation around the world are of the type that we call light water reactors. Without getting into too many details, what that basically means is that the coolant, the fluid that removes the energy from the core of the reactor or the fission where the nuclear reaction takes place and takes it elsewhere, as Sukesh explained, where basically it's used to boil water, make steam, turn a turbine, and produce and generate electricity. That fluid is water. It's just simple water. Okay, that technology is well known, has been used for decades. The most popular embodiment of it is in the form of a 1,000 megawatt or plus reactor. So the fleet that we currently operate in the United States, 92 reactors, on average, the power output per reactor is around 1,000 megawatts. Now, let me be clear. This is very reliable technology. It's actually cost effective because all these plants have already been paid back, essentially. And so we should, to the extent that it's safe doing so, continue to operate and extend our license and all of that. The key question is, Now that we're thinking about expanding the capacity of nuclear for all the applications and missions that John alluded to and I already mentioned, not just electricity, heat, etc., should we build the same technologies or should we build something else? So for those of you who have been following the history of the nuclear industry, you may have heard that the past 15 years have not been particularly successful in terms of deploying new nuclear power plants, particularly of this type, of this large-scale type that I just described. It's nothing to do with the nuclear side of the technology. It has almost everything to do with managing a large construction site, having a supply chain that is efficient, and a regulatory system that sort of is streamlined and allows for the authorization of and the approval of these projects to go through quickly. So there is now a lot of interest in the industry in the United States, but I would say also worldwide, for smaller machines. Smaller means lower power output, but perhaps more importantly, physically smaller. They can be built in a more nimble and predictable way, and therefore reduce the financial risk for all the actors involved in the project. Now, having established what small means, it typically means hundreds of megawatts as opposed to thousands of megawatts. Now, let me sort of walk you through the types of reactors that are being deployed and considered at the moment. So the first type is literally a shrunk down version of those large machines. Instead of having a gigawatt, I can shrink it, I can redesign it to make it, let's say, 200, 300 megawatts. And the primary intended mission of these reactors is to replace coal-fired plants or natural gas-fired plants on the grid. And we know that we have hundreds such plants that have to be replaced if we're serious about decarbonizing the grid, not just in the United States, actually thousands worldwide. So we have a couple of real projects in the US, I would say in North America, with this type of technology. One is at the Darlington site in Ontario, in Canada, with a technology that is being developed by General Electric Hitachi. Another one is NuScale at a site in Idaho, which will serve a consortium of utilities in Utah. The second class of new reactors that are being considered, let me call them generically high temperature reactors. If you switch from water as your coolant to a different fluid, you can now operate your reactor at a higher temperature. Why is that good? Why is that beneficial? For two reasons. First, because through the laws of thermodynamics, if you operate your reactor at a higher temperature, you have a higher efficiency of converting heat, which is what the reactor gives you, to electricity, which is what your customer wants. So it's a more efficient, intrinsically more efficient reactor. Number two, perhaps even more important, it opens up new markets. Because as I already said a couple of times, not all customers want electricity only. Some customers, big customers, chemical plants, many processes, district heating, you name it. What they want is heat, and they want sometimes heat at high temperature. So these reactors can deliver heat at those high temperatures. And then the third class of new reactors that are being developed and deployed is what they call microreactors. These are literally factory fabricated, much smaller. You're now down to, say, 5 to 10 megawatts, much smaller, fabricated in factories as opposed to assembled, built in large construction sites, delivered in one or multiple pieces to a user, to a site, and sort of through plug and play connections, you get to get the energy, either heat or electricity or both, within days or weeks as opposed to months and years. So they address three different markets. For all three categories, we have serious ongoing projects. I mentioned the ones for the first category. Let me just mention the real projects for the other two. We have the one that I already said is Dow Chemical with X Energy for a chemical plant in either Texas or Louisiana. I forgot. I apologize. So that uses a high temperature reactor. And then the U.S. Army is actually on a fast track to use one of these small microreactors for forward operating bases and also stateside bases to provide the energy that they need. And that is likely to be the first new reactor that we're going to deploy here in the US of this new generation. In fact, they expect this to be ready in 2025. So 2 years from now, which, in nuclear space, it's pretty fast. So apologize, long answer, but I think it deserves attention because there is so much going on. And finally, it's not just R&D, but it's real projects being launched and being executed. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you, Jacobo. So we are on question 6, and I see, I haven't looked at the chat, but I can see coming on my screen, some people are repeating their question. As I said, please let us go through our questions, and promise you we're gonna answer all the questions that we can tonight. There should be plenty of time. When I said we are halfway through, I meant we were halfway through our questions, not for the session. So with that, we are going to question 7 right now, and this one is again for John, and this would be discuss the U.S. and global outlook for new nuclear and the barriers we face, concerns about non-proliferation, export controls, cost, time, nuclear waste, licensing, restrictions, etc. So this goes to John.
Thanks, Bob. And given the time, I'll just touch on a few of these things. In terms of the outlook for U.S. and global nuclear energy, we, NEI, as trade association, represent most of the companies that operate nuclear power plants in the U.S. So we've asked our members what they see as the outlook for nuclear in the U.S. They expect to see us roughly double the amount of nuclear generation that we have online in the United States by the 2050s. Depending to Jacobo's earlier point, depending on how some of these early construction projects go, you may see that demand increase or decrease, depending on affordability and timeliness questions. But the companies that are responsible for keeping the lights on around the country are essentially all now looking at new nuclear as they look at shutting down coal and moving away from gas. In terms of the international outlook, Jacobo gave a great list earlier, so I won't try to go over all of those. It was a long list, and there are even other countries that are interested in new nuclear. I will say, if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports, they forecast roughly a doubling of nuclear energy globally, again, by 2050. Again, that's going to, it's going to vary depending on country. But some in particular, I'll point to Poland, for example, which has no nuclear power right now and is heavily reliant on coal, something like 80% of their electricity. They're trying to move fast, and frankly, they want to work with the U.S. They don't want to work with Russia or China in developing those new technologies. That brings me to my next point. When you look at the global marketplace for civil nuclear energy technology, there are really only a handful of countries that supply this technology. Now, we led the first wave of global nuclear deployment really outside of the sphere of the old former Soviet Union. Today, the Russians are the largest supplier worldwide. China is seeking to be a very strong competitor on the global stage, and we just don't have the leadership role that we once had. Now, I think this next generation of technologies that Jacopo talked about can springboard us back into that leadership role. But frankly, we've got to first show that we can deploy those technologies here at home successfully if we're really going to unleash the market opportunity that exists globally. Now, we had that market size estimated by a consultancy a couple of years ago. If we do in fact see this doubling of global nuclear by mid-century, that represents something on the order of an $8 trillion opportunity, both just to build plants and just to help with fuel and servicing those plants. We stand to capture a large share of that opportunity if in fact we can get these new technologies into the marketplace. So there's a real commercial reason for us to want to lead. There are a lot of other reasons too, though. I mean, when you're working with another country to build a nuclear power plant, you're not just selling them a product, you're also working with them on things like nuclear safety regulation, training the operators, nuclear waste management, physical and cyber security, a whole range of areas where frankly you want US norms to win the day. You don't want people, adopting the Russian or the Chinese approach to dealing with issues like that. So there's a lot at stake for the U.S. in competing and winning in those global markets. I do see in the chat, we have had a couple of questions about waste, and so let me take that one on in particular. I'm going to drop another link in the chat for folks who want to check this out. I think it's important to recognize just what we talk about nuclear waste, right? when we talk about that, what we mean is really the spent nuclear fuel. That's where most of the radioactivity is coming out of a nuclear reactor. If you haven't seen it before, it can be easy to think, get a misimpression about what spent nuclear fuel is. If you look at a nuclear fuel assembly in one of our commercial reactors in the US, it's a collection of fuel pellets, a hard ceramic about the size of the tip of your finger. They go into a long metal tube, we call it cladding. Those long metal tubes are put into a bundle we call a fuel assembly, and you'll have a few hundred of those in a reactor, give and take, depending on the reactor type. After about 5 years in the reactor, that fuel comes out. It looks the same. Now, what's happened is a lot of the uranium that was in that fuel was caused to split, release heat, and create something we call fission products. Those are just the leftovers of the split uranium. That's where the radioactivity is. Okay, and so that stays in the fuel though. So you've got these fission products contained in a ceramic inside of a metal tube. We take that spent fuel out of the reactor core. When it comes out of the reactor core, it's still hot, both thermally and radioactively. So you keep it in a pool for a few years. After it cools down enough, you put it into what we call a dry storage cask, which is just a steel, container with a concrete overpack. You put it out on a concrete pad and you air cool it, and there it sits. I'll give you an example. If you look at all of the spent fuel that was generated at the Connecticut Yankee nuclear plant, which ran for about 30 years, all of that spent fuel in the containers sits on a pad about the size of a hockey rink. That reactor produced enough power that if you had produced that same amount of power using natural gas, you could have filled the Superdome with carbon dioxide 3,000 times. Okay, it's just a massive savings in terms of waste generation. We know where it is. It's straightforward to manage. My old office in Idaho was a couple hundred yards from several spent fuel storage facilities. You can visit the nuclear power plant today and go visit the dry storage. It's perfectly safe to walk up to the fence, what have you. It's very straightforward to manage this stuff. Now, for the long term, we need to develop a repository, and that's typically thought of as a mined structure underground where you're going to put this stuff for a long period of time to keep it safe from people in the environment. But we know how to do that too. Finland is building theirs now. Canada is in the process of picking a site. Sweden has picked a site. We're behind, but it's more of a socio-political problem for us than it is a technical problem. We know what to do in the long term. In the short term, it's very straightforward to manage this stuff safely on site. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you, John. Thank you for taking that question. Just to add it, these are some bits and pieces of information I want to share with the audience around the world. China has added 22 reactors to their fleet since 2018, has 14 reactors under construction and exporting 2. Russia has 3 units under construction and exporting 12 units. Italy has shut down all their nukes. Germany is almost dead with 1 remaining or 2. Spain, they planning to shut down. Hopefully they're going to change their mind. Korea, new president, as Jacobo said, to reverse the previous administration's decision, stop building new units, and they're going to operate. France announced building new units. So did UK, and United Arab Emirates, as we all know, they have 4 huge units under construction. 3 are operating. 3 operating, 1 to finish soon. Construction started in 2012, and those are Korean reactors with U.S. technology and U.S. support. So this is where we are, and these are the constructions. And we have only 2 under construction right now in the U.S., and those are Vogtle Unit 3 and 4. So with that, we go to our 4th question, or 8th question, and this one is for Jacobo. And there's a huge renewed interest in nuclear power. What would derail this renewed interest? Go ahead, Jacobo.
All right, thanks, Bob. So we've given you all the good news so far. Now, we also need to tell you what the concerns are. So in my opinion, there are 3 potential showstoppers here that could bring this momentum to a screeching halt. The first, if we have another major accident anywhere, either in the US or internationally, this will likely set back the industry a decade, and potentially making it irrelevant in the effort to address climate change, energy security, and all of that. Now, we can debate whether the accidents that we've seen for example, Fukushima or 3 Mile Island, have had any real public health impact or not. The United Nations has a very rigorous study out there, a committee that spent a lot of time studying Fukushima, and they concluded that in fact the radiological impact of Fukushima was very low. Nonetheless, in terms of perceptions, in terms of retrofitting, upgrading plants, and therefore costs associated with accidents, these are fairly painful experiences. They're also learning experiences because there is a lot that we learn from accidents to improve the technology. But I would say a major accident will certainly set things back badly. That's the first concern. Number two, I already mentioned how we have now finally a series of real projects here in North America and also in Western Europe. If any of those projects, which are really based on technologies that I've already described, are different from the traditional large-scale light water reactors, but if any of those projects even resemble vaguely the projects of the past 15 years in terms of cost overruns and schedule delays, I think this will leave a very sour taste, particularly in the investment communities that is putting now money into new nuclear. So once again, the onus is very much on the industry at the moment to ensure that this new wave of new nuclear power plant construction projects is executed flawlessly, or in any case, in a healthy manner. And then the third is maybe a little bit more subtle. Traditionally, nuclear has been used for generation of electricity on the grid. That's still a very important market. It's considered the linchpin of climate change mitigation. Thou shalt decarbonize the grid first. But if you look at the emissions, CO2 emissions on a global scale, only about a quarter actually come from the production of electricity. The other 75% come from transportation sector, industry, buildings, and even agriculture. So if we're serious about this business of decarbonizing, we need energy sources that can address emissions across all sectors of the economy. And so I feel strongly that nuclear has to play a role beyond just the grid. And on the grid, that there is an additional sort of challenge, which is the ultimate commodity market. The electrons, nobody cares where the electrons come from once they're on the grid, right? They all sort of circulate seamlessly. So you're producing commodity, which is not particularly attractive from an investment point of view. Whereas there are many other applications where nuclear can really fill a unique mission and therefore be more valued. And so once again, making the investment more attractive. So, Bob, back to you. I think those are the three big challenges that we're facing now. So again, an accident, a repeat of past dysfunctional projects, and then being confined only to the grid.
Correct. Thank you, Jacopo. That's great. So we are down to our final question, which now it's more for the audience because it relates to our state, Massachusetts. So this is the question, and this goes for Sukesh. We closed Pilgrim a few years back. That's the nuclear plant that we had running in Plymouth, Mass, called Pilgrim. We have no commercial nuclear plants running in our state. We also closed Vermont Yankee and Maine Yankee, Connecticut Yankee, and Millstone Unit 1 in Connecticut, and Yankee Row, which was an old plant in Massachusetts a few years back. We now have only 2 nuclear plants, 3 units running in New England, 1 in New Hampshire, that's Seabrook, and then 2 in Connecticut, which is Millstone Unit 2 and 3. So this is in our New England state. So what would it take to bring back nuclear power to our state, Massachusetts? Sukesh.
Thanks, Bob. Well, within the last 45 minutes, I quoted about 45% of the energy in California was produced from renewables. So sun is about to set, and that's in a sunny state of California. And now it's only about 36%. And so as you start to look at that, the renewable component going down, especially if you have solar and wind, they do have battery deployment, and it's about 0.4%. And I do anticipate in the next decade, the batteries are going to add. I also have 2 power walls in my house. It's nice. And so I think that there's going to be some storage capacity that will get deployed. So I think for nuclear to kind of come back to New England state, I think there are several places where there is an opportunity. Some of the new technologies that we've been talking about, I always see New England as a sort of an innovative state, and I think we want to be in the forefront of technology. I see that there is an opportunity, given the way that we use energy and where we would be using energy, as an opportunity to maybe pursue a small modular reactor type technology, or potentially even a micro reactor type technology. Where we might put one, has been shown time and again that nuclear does bring high-paying jobs. There could be an option in the Western Mass, maybe through a partnership with the university. In fact, both MIT at Jacobo and at UMass Lowell, we have a research reactor. These research reactors have superstructures. These were built back in the 1950s. Could easily accommodate a microreactor. I don't think this reactor technology was mentioned, but Da Vinci is one of the small microreactor that is being developed by Westinghouse. There are a couple of other commercial reactor technologies that are being discussed. And these would be reactors that are not necessarily only providing electrons. In fact, I think that decoupling from electricity is where some of the opportunities are there. If you think in terms of New England, we do consume a lot of energy just to keep things warm. I know it's kind of hard to think about it this winter because it's been incredibly mild. But we do rely, we don't have natural gas because I'm on a state forest, and I use oil, which is even worse because now I have diesel trucks that come twice a month to deliver oil into my basement. So what are we going to do about decarbonization and climate responsibilities, even if I were to go to some kind of an alternative source? So I think district heating could make sense. In fact, I am working on a project with a counterpart in Czech Republic, looking at a zero power district heating solution that could be nuclear based. And so there are some innovative solutions that are outside of just the electricity generation. And I think there are also possibilities of sites within New England where we might be able to explore a small modular reactor or a micro reactor possibility. As we start to understand the technology, as we understand the consequences of non-proliferation and how we manage that, and seen the history in terms of how we are able to modify these reactor designs in terms of accident tolerant fuels. So I think that I do see that in the next decade, just in terms of the innovative technology deployment, Massachusetts could start to explore a possibility of a reactor.
Thank you, Sukesh. Thank you. And again, as I said, I myself started my career at Pilgrim Nuclear Station that's being decommissioned right now. That site, believe it or not, was supposed to be a 4-unit site. And Unit 2, when I was there, was well under design, and they procured equipment and whatnot. And sure enough, in 1982, they stopped it because of 3 Mile Island accident. That was a huge setback to the industry, even though 3 Mile Island did not, it was a bad accident. Excuse me. But what it did, basically, we learned a lot from 3 Mile Island, and we fixed a lot of things in our plants, but that really changed the landscape for new nuclears, and Pilgrim ended up being a single nuke. That's a nice site. To me, we cannot, reactors there, but that would take, the state, and I think there's a huge interest. I've talked to our legislature in Massachusetts, and they do have an interest, but I'm not that close to the politics to see what would it take to really convince to build one of these in our state, because if not, then we all saying we need nuclear, but not in my backyard. So it's kind of like Europe. Germany shut down their nukes, but they're buying it from, France power, and 75% of their electricity comes from nuclear. So and I'm glad right now there's a, public, interest and change of mind, and for good reason. So with that, we are done with our questions, and time-wise, we are doing exactly what I expected. We are an hour into it. I have not looked at the chat and the questions, so maybe, where would I see it? Where are the questions?
Hey, Bob, while you look
Yes.
through the questions,
Yeah.
I think Holtec has not been mentioned yet in our discussions, but Holtec is the one that took over Pilgrim, and they also have a small modular reactor design. So I know I don't want to be, I think where we cite it is a whole different issue, but I think that there are vendors who have technology in the development stages that could potentially start to explore sites. And since you did bring up Pilgrim, it is a significantly smaller footprint. And a lot of these sites will maintain a license because of the spent fuel storage they currently have.
That's right, yeah.
And Bob, while you're looking through, there are a few questions in here that maybe we can start jumping on now while you're
Please, yeah.
looking at the larger list. I'm just starting close to the top here. There was a question about what is radioactive pollution. I'm assuming that the questioner was referring to nuclear waste there. We talked about that a little bit earlier. There's a comment in here about Japan. I think that we talked about that. Someone asked about nuclear submarines reliably powering, or nuclear reliably powering submarines and aircraft carriers for decades. For folks who don't know, interestingly, there's about the same number of nuclear reactors that are used by our nuclear navy as we have nuclear power reactors in the U.S. On the order of 100. Powering aircraft carriers and submarines, and interestingly, that technology has evolved. We talk about how nuclear technology has gotten better over the 60 years that we've been using it to create energy here in the U.S. I think the Navy gives a really good parallel example. When they started using nuclear-powered submarines in the 50s, those submarines could go about 18 months to 2 years between refuelings. Now the fuel lasts the life of the ship, more than 30 years, and they never have to stop to refuel a nuclear submarine. That gives you a sense of the advancement in the technology that's taken place over the last 60 years. I think you're about to see similar sorts of leaps in the technology we use for commercial nuclear power. The questioner was wondering about using nuclear for shipping. Jacopo, I know you folks have been looking a little bit at that. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was about to jump in fact. So there is interest because, as the person who asked the question correctly points out, there is a large fraction of emissions that are associated with the shipping industry. So marine applications. Of course, the technologies will have to be different from the reactors that the Navy has been using. In the Navy, they use highly enriched uranium, which is potential proliferation risk. For commercial applications, you have to go to low enriched uranium. That forces some design choices for the type of reactor that makes sense. But there is interest, there is active interest, and there are different ways in which you could decarbonize that sector. Perhaps the lowest hanging fruit is not to actually use nuclear directly for propulsion, but to use land-based reactors to actually produce carbon-free or carbon-neutral fuels, liquid fuels that could be used as drop-in fuels in existing ships. And so what you need in that case is a carbon feed. This could come from either biomass, or it could come from capture of CO2 either from the air or from seawater itself, combined with hydrogen, which you obtain by splitting H2O, by splitting water. You can actually make synthetic liquid fuels, which then could be used by the ships or even airplanes, and they would be either carbon negative or carbon neutral. The next logical step would be indeed to put nuclear reactors on large ships. I think it's realistic, particularly transoceanic, where it makes a lot of sense to use to leverage the efficiency of nuclear. But I think that's still a little bit further out, primarily because of regulatory issues. As soon as you touch new domains in which nuclear energy has to be used, and all sorts of interesting questions in the regulatory space come up.
Thank you. So I had a chance to kind of go through questions, but some of them are more comments. I'm just going to pick one, and I've asked also Gary to help me picking some other ones. I'm not being particular. So there's one, some nuclear reactors can also be used to make fuel for atomic bombs. I don't know. Somebody throw that question out there, and
So maybe Bob, I can quickly comment on this.
Please, yeah.
So the fresh fuel that is used in all commercial nuclear power plants is what we call low enriched uranium. So it's actually unsuitable as fuel for bombs. However, all reactors also breed in as they operate. They actually create a little bit of plutonium, and the isotope 239 of plutonium is potentially usable as fuel for weapons. Having said that, separating that plutonium from the rest of the fuel is not easy. It requires a heavy-duty industrial installation in which, from a chemical point of view, through chemical processes, you can separate that. If you look historically, the path towards proliferation that uses commercial fuel facilities has not been very used. So countries that have wanted to produce bombs, they've basically gone straight for either highly enriched uranium, primarily highly enriched uranium, and then use that in bombs. So yes, theoretically there is a risk, but I think through technology choices and importantly international institutional barriers, so checks and balances, the IEA plays a very important role. You have inspectors all over the place. Multilateral agreements and things of that type, we've been able to keep that situation sort of in check, for lack of a better word.
Great, thank you, Jacobo. That's good. Thanks. There's one question. This says discuss NRC's regulation, especially the new regulations with the new SMRs in mind. John, do you want to take a stab at it? I mean, I have some ideas. What the
I'll just start by saying, certainly the NRC has shown over the decades to be a very competent regulator in terms of ensuring that we maintain safe nuclear operations here in the US. We do have some challenges with them in the sense that they really haven't done much in the past several decades in the area of licensing new designs and bringing them into operation. Now we're seeing the first new nuclear plants in the US built in several decades about to come online in the state of Georgia, but it's going to require the NRC to really modernize its approach and get more efficient while still maintaining safety if we're going to achieve the levels of nuclear growth that I think we are going to need to see if we're going to successfully decarbonize our economy. Really what it's about is, as I mentioned earlier, the technology has changed quite a bit over the last 60 years. We need the NRC to evolve along with it. Bob, you deal with them quite a bit, so very interested in what you'd add to that.
Oh, definitely. And, SMRs have been licensed in this country. NuScale is one of them. So that process, it was longer than expected, but at the end of the day, they were licensed. But that technology is more, I'm going to say, a proven technology. So again, your question, or the question was specifically regarding the SMR. So I don't think SMRs are an issue as far as licensing and NRC's regulation. We have been involved with even some of the new isotope production facilities, and they go through the same process. They have the similar requirements. And one of them was recently also the safety evaluation, 785 pages was written and, approved out there. So the process is there, could be faster in comparison to other countries. We do have a longer process for licensing these new reactors. Having said that, I think any new technology would take longer time. Definitely the NRC is going that way, but I think the process would be a bit longer. But your question was about SMRs, which I don't think it's an issue.
Bob, I do think it's worth mentioning for folks, I should have mentioned this earlier. For those who don't know, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is responsible for overseeing the use of, I'll say, civil nuclear technology here in the U.S., their staffing is around 3,000 people. They've got resident inspectors at every nuclear power plant in the U.S. They've got regional offices for them around the country, and then a big headquarters about 1.5 miles from where I'm sitting. So it's quite a robust and very technically competent agency, just to the points we both made. It's one that needs to evolve along with the technology. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Just picking another question. What will come down faster in terms of cost and speed of deployment, nuclear or batteries? That's a good question. And I'm going to try to answer this one. I think there are two different things. Batteries, in my assessment, is not going to replace nuclear. Batteries need chargers, and you can charge batteries using nuclear power, wind and solar, but wind and solar are there only when there's wind and there's sun. So batteries have limited capacity, and also their discharge time is 8 hours. So after 8 hours, 1 megawatt of battery, you need to recharge them. So again, I don't want to compare them, but I think the better question here should be what can we do to build these plants faster and, I'm going to say, cheaper? And I think some of that was already discussed by, I'm going to say, even Sukesh and maybe Jacobo, that in all honesty, we haven't built new reactors in this country for many years. The last real reactor we built was in mid-'80s. After that, we finished 2 remaining reactors, which was Watts-Bar Unit 1 and 2. And those were completed in, Unit 1 was 96 and Unit 2 was mid-2000, I think. But really, it was old construction that we finished. The real new reactor that we are building here are Vogtle 1, 3, and 4, new technology. In building one reactor, the economy of scale is not there. Finding resources, even equipment, even material, craftsmen. If you're not building 20, 30 of them like we used to, in 70s and all the way till early 80s, we had many of them under construction, and so there was an interest to have the infrastructure with staff, with crafts, with designers, with architects, and with suppliers. But when the industry goes away, so does the supply chain. So those things, if we're going to build one every 10, 15 years, we are not going to get there. We really have to have a plan and, push for it and commit to this technology. And so the companies would come and start building the parts and equipment and the pumps and valves you need for these units. So that's what it would take. I let other panelists to comment, please.
So can I jump in there for a second?
Please.
So I think batteries is more of a materials issue, right? And I think as we get more resources available and learn how to sort of harvest lithium and others, we might draw down the price of battery. However, as you already mentioned, nuclear. But what we're talking about is not a battery storage solution at a grid scale. There are other grid scale storage solutions that are being developed, and some of these nuclear companies are also working on these things called thermal storage, which could be coupled with a nuclear power plant where you might use salt to store energy and then recover it as a source of energy. So I think that those would be more at the industrial scale, which means that you really have to have the construction capability and the materials advancements. And that would provide a likely solution as we deploy massively renewable energy and then have a need for storage. I don't know if battery by themselves at grid scale would be a substitute for all of the storage capacity that we would need in an event that we don't necessarily go to nuclear and then basically go 100% renewable coupled with storage. So I think it's important to understand, and we've really not talked about, in spite of the fact that we have 2 faculty members, the workforce aspect of all of this. There is a significant amount of technological and engineering and science and technicians that are needed in order to do any of these things, any energy solutions, including storage. And so I think there some of the things that we are doing in the United States is one of our products is actually students, a well-trained workforce. And I think that is important to maintain our leading edge in that too. So.
Yeah, but this question of cost is so important. Let me add my 2 cents, no pun intended here. So first, when it comes to the cost of nuclear decreasing, I would be content to see any reduction in the cost of nuclear, because in the past 15, 20 years, we already commented a few times, we haven't seen it at all. We've seen the other way, continuing escalating. So what are the approaches? I agree with you, Bob. You have to essentially rebuild a supply chain. You have to rebuild capabilities. So, to your point, capability is not just materials, is not just components, is people as well. In terms of how you actually build them more efficiently, I usually talk about 3 strategies. The first is multiple identical units at the same site. We've seen it over and over again. If the same workforce builds the same plant, the same site over and over again, the second unit is going to cost less than the first, the third less than the second, the fourth less than the third. This is not rocket science. People learn. Okay, it's the same people, and they have to redo the same task. They do it better. They do it more efficiently. So if a utility has a need for, say, a couple of thousand megawatt of generation, and you build it in small chunks, say 300 and so then you're in for 7 or 8 units at the same site, and that is for sure going to reduce cost, number one. Number two, the traditional approach of building plants is heavily relying on the construction site itself. You bring raw materials, you bring components, and then you literally assemble the plant on site. Well, we have discovered, as part of the study that I mentioned at the beginning in my introduction, that the construction sector productivity has actually been decreasing in the United States steadily since the 1960s, whereas the manufacturing sector productivity has been exponentially increasing over the past few decades. The implication of this is that you want to shift as much scope of the project from a low productivity environment, which is a construction site, to a high productivity environment, which is factories and shipyards. Shipyards are also quite productive. So if you can prefabricate large modules in factories and shipyards, and then ship or transport those large modules to the site, and then simply connecting them, then you can realize some significant cost reductions. And this has been done in the chemical industry for many years, and they have some serious cost savings to show for it. The third approach has to do with concrete. This is the most mundane, one of the most mundane commodities that we use in constructing nuclear power plants is reinforced concrete. Well, it's mundane, but it's actually very labor intensive and complicated to get it right, particularly when you have to get it to what we call nuclear grade or nuclear quality, okay? Because you got to first build a rebar cage, then wood formwork, then pour the concrete, and then let it settle and strip off the form woodwork. So again, lots of steps, lots of people involved, many opportunities to make mistakes. There are now new concrete technologies like steel bricks or steel plate composites or ultra high performance concrete that reduce or eliminate some of these steps, and therefore do offer the opportunity for streamlining the construction of the civil works, which are such a big part of the scope of a new nuclear project. So these are some of the ideas that I think that the industry is playing around with. If they're successful, I think you'll see there is a high chance the cost will come down.
Agree, definitely. Any other comments from other panelists? No. Okay, Gary, do you have any specific questions? I know you've been looking at the chat room. Is there anything we haven't covered that, I try to pick certain ones that anything you would like us to cover?
One thing I would ask is, it was mentioned earlier, the kind of socio-political challenges around nuclear waste. I think also just in general, NIMBY challenges associated with where are you going to build these things and how are people going to feel about even having the small modular reactors or some of these dedicated reactors, for example, was it Dow Chemical or whoever it was that was using it for process workflows. Do the panelists have any views about, how the conversation is going nationally for us, and are we going to be able to address these challenges, these social political challenges, including particularly the one of, whether we ever open Yucca Mountain or if we have some other solution to long-term storage of nuclear waste?
Yeah, well, I'd say how much time do you have on that last question? But on the question about sort of NIMBY and attitudes towards facility siting, it's interesting. So as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Wayland and Salem before that, so outside of Boston, but spent a lot of my career living in Idaho. And the part of the country I lived in, the elected officials out there are tripping over each other to be able to take credit for being the one to bring the next nuclear facility to town. Okay, where I lived, again, was close to the Idaho National Laboratory. When Jacopo and I were out there, it was something like 8,000 people working out on the laboratory site, and it's grown since then. There's an appreciation and awareness of what it means to host a nuclear facility that has translated into just tremendous public support. If you look next door in the state of Wyoming, the Bill Gates company, TerraPower, that we mentioned earlier, is building their first of a kind nuclear plant, actually at the site of a coal plant that has been slated for closure in a small community in western Wyoming. The experience that TerraPower and their partner utility, Rocky Mountain Power, had was that they actually had 4 communities competing to host the nuclear facility, all of which are facing the shutdown of a coal plant, and all of which are really concerned about their economic future. Similar dynamics can be seen around the sites that currently host nuclear power plants. So, for example, the 2 new plants being built in Georgia are being built at the site at a site that already hosts 2 operating reactors, and there's the local community has been nothing but supportive. So there are a lot of places in the country that would welcome new nuclear power plant construction. It might be harder to do in suburban Boston certainly than other parts of the country. The good news is that because nuclear power plants, even the smaller ones, because they put out so much power, I don't need to be able to build them everywhere. Now, it's helpful to be able to build them near load centers, because then you avoid the need to have to build transmission. But to the extent that you've got transmission, or that you're within a reasonable proximity of a large load, you don't need to build a whole lot more nuclear. Again, we've got just north of 50 nuclear power plant sites in the US. All told, there are about 10,000 power plants connected to the grid. Okay, so nuclear represents less than 1% of the power plants in the US, produces almost 20% of the electricity. Again, because they're so big. So I just need to find enough places around the country that are willing to host these facilities. And our experience has been, I'm not going to go try to build one in Marin County, California, right out of the gate. But there are enough places around the US that would welcome them that I think we can manage that issue. And frankly, I hope someday we can have this a serious conversation about some of these advanced reactors or SMRs in Massachusetts and New England, because frankly, I think you need it.
Yeah,
Well,
I agree.
thank you for that. Well, I love, Bob, that you gave me the last question, and we're coming to the end of our hour and a half, so I guess we should wrap it up. Do you have final remarks before turning it back to Amy?
No, I just want to thank the audience for allowing us to share our views about this important topic. I hope we conveyed our views as as clear as we could, and that's about it. Thank you for everybody's time. Thanks. Amy?
Well, thanks, Bob, for moderating, and thanks to our wonderful panelists for an extremely educational and interesting discussion on the role nuclear energy may have as we address our climate crisis and remove our reliance on fossil fuels. Thanks also to our audience for joining us this evening. And I see State Rep Kay Khan was here. Thank you for also joining us. Special thanks to Gary Rosinski for organizing our panels and Lucia Dolan as our technical support. If you enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, please keep an eye out for more in the series in the future. Thank you everyone for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again at future climate crisis discussion panels. Have a good evening.
Thanks.